On the lands between, silence is never empty. It settles gently over ruined chapels, over fields where golden grass bends without wind, and over statues whose eyes have watched centuries pass without a single word. Many believe that the world of Elden Ring is ruled by loud powers, shattering wars, clashing demigods, thunderous miracles. Yet beneath all of this noise lies a deeper truth. The most powerful forces in this world do not shout, they do not march, they do not explain themselves. They wait. Long before the shattering fractured the Elden Ring, long before tarnished souls were called back by distant grace, the lands between were already shaped by beings who never walked its soil. These were not gods in the human sense. They had no faces to remember, no voices to hear, no stories told directly by them. Instead, they were outer gods, distant cosmic powers whose influence seeped into reality like slow-moving water through stone. To understand Elden Ring, one must first understand this quiet hierarchy of divinity. At the highest level of the world's divine structure exists something known as the Greater Will. It is not a ruler sitting upon a throne, nor a god who intervenes personally. The Greater Will functions more like a governing principle of existence. It imposes order upon chaos, not through force, but through systems. This is the first great truth of the lands between. Power here does not act directly. It creates rules, then allows the world to suffer beneath them. The Greater Will's most important creation was not a weapon or a being, but a concept made physical, the Elden Ring itself. Contrary to its name, the Elden Ring is not a simple object. It is a collection of runes, each one representing a law of reality: life, death, causality, regression, order. These runes do not merely symbolize these ideas, they enforce them. When assembled, they dictate how the world functions at the most fundamental level. This is how the world truly works in Elden Ring. Reality is modular. Change the runes, and the rules change. The Greater Will did not rule the lands between by command. It ruled by installing the Elden Ring as the operating system of existence itself. And once this system was in place, it needed caretakers. Thus came the vessels. A god in the lands between is not born divine. A god is chosen, shaped, and bound. Queen Marika was not a creator god. She was an emperine, selected as a vessel capable of housing the Elden Ring. Her body became the anchor point through which the Greater Will's order flowed into the world. Yet even Marika never spoke for the Greater Will directly. Instead, communication passed through intermediaries far stranger and more unsettling: the Two Fingers. These towering flesh-like beings served as living antennas of divine will. They did not think independently, they interpreted. They translated the unknowable intentions of the Greater Will into prophecy, guidance, and command. When the fingers moved, when they twitched or pointed, entire ages shifted. This reveals another quiet system of the world. Divine authority in Elden Ring is always indirect. The Greater Will does not speak. The fingers do not understand. Mortals obey interpretations of silence. This distance is not a flaw, it is deliberate. Silence creates faith. Ambiguity creates control. As long as no one can hear the Greater Will clearly, its servants can claim to speak for it. But the lands between are not ruled by one silent god alone. Beyond the Greater Will exist other outer gods, each embodying forces that lie outside its vision of order. These beings do not compete openly. They seep into reality through affliction, emotion, and imbalance. The formless mother, for instance, is not worshipped through temples or prayers. She manifests through blood, through wounds, through sacrifice. Her influence grows wherever suffering is offered willingly. Those who bleed in devotion become conduits, their pain transformed into communion. Here we learn another system of the world. Outer gods require conditions, not belief. They do not need followers who understand them. They need environments where their essence can take root. Rot requires decay. Frenzied flame requires despair. Blood requires violence and devotion. These gods spread not through sermons, but through states of being. This is why the lands between feel cursed rather than conquered. No outer god ever truly arrives. They simply awaken something already present. The scarlet rot did not invade the world. It bloomed where stagnation allowed it. The frenzied flame did not descend from the sky. It emerged where hopelessness burned long enough to turn into madness. Even the Erd tree itself, golden and radiant, is not purely benevolent. It is a symbol of imposed order. Its roots wrap around graves, absorbing the dead, recycling souls back into the system governed by the Elden ring. Death under this order is not an ending, it is a function. This is why the removal of the rune of death changed everything. When Marika separated death from the Elden ring, she did not defy mortality out of kindness. She broke a rule of reality. Without true death, souls lingered, bodies decayed incorrectly, the natural cycle twisted. Immortality became stagnation, and stagnation is fertile ground for silent gods. The shattering was not merely a war between demigods, it was the sound of a system breaking. With the Elden ring fractured, the greater will's control weakened. Its silence grew longer, its intermediaries faltered, and into that growing quiet, other forces leaned closer, listening, waiting. The tarnished, called back by grace, do not return to a stable world. They awaken in a place where divine order has lost clarity, where the fingers hesitate, where gods no longer agree, where silence stretches so long that even faith begins to rot. And this is where our story truly begins. Not with heroes or battles, but with a question whispered beneath the Erd tree's fading glow. If the gods never speak, who has truly been listening all this time? As the Erd tree's light dimmed, something subtle began to change in the lands between. Not a collapse, not a sudden darkness, but a loosening. Where once the golden order pressed firmly upon every living thing, now there were gaps, places where grace did not quite reach, places where roots no longer glowed, places where silence grew thick enough to feel heavy in the air. It is in these spaces that the silent gods are strongest. The people of the lands between rarely speak of outer gods by name. Most do not even realize such beings exist. Instead, they give names to symptoms, to curses, to afflictions that seem personal, yet spread with uncanny consistency. Madness, rot, unending bloodshed, dreamless immortality. Each of these is not merely a condition, each is a language, and among them none speaks more softly, nor more terribly than the frenzied flame. The frenzied flame is not a god of fire in the common sense. It does not burn to consume. It burns to erase distinction. Where it spreads, the world loses its edges. Thought becomes noise. Identity dissolves. Pain and joy blur together until nothing remains but a desperate desire for everything to end. This is how the frenzied flame works. It does not conquer through armies or miracles. It infects the mind. Its influence begins as despair, as the quiet belief that suffering is endless, that order is a lie, that existence itself is a mistake. When this belief deepens, the flame awakens. In the lands between, madness is not treated as an illness. It is treated as a contagion of meaning. Yellow eyes, burning tears, uncontrolled laughter. These are not random signs. They mark individuals whose perception has cracked wide enough for the flame to look back. The 3 fingers serve this power, just as the 2 fingers serve the greater will. Yet unlike their orderly counterparts, the 3 fingers do not interpret divine law. They offer release. They promise a world without hierarchy, without gods, without suffering. A single burning unity where nothing can hurt because nothing can remain separate. Here we learn a crucial truth about Elden Ring's divine structure. Outer gods do not offer solutions, they offer endings. The greater will imposes order endlessly, even when it causes suffering. The frenzied flame rejects order entirely, even if that means annihilation. Both are extremes. Neither speaks with compassion. Both remain silent, allowing their followers to justify everything. And this pattern repeats. Consider the scarlet rot. It is often described as a disease, but this is a misunderstanding. Rot in Elden Ring is a cosmic principle embodied by an outer god whose name is never spoken. This god does not desire death. It desires transformation through decay, endless change without rebirth. Rot thrives where life cannot properly end. This is why the rot blossomed most fiercely in Caelid and within Melania herself. She was cursed from birth, not as punishment, but as a vessel. Her body became a battlefield where the Golden Order's refusal of true death clashed with Rot's demand for constant change. The system here is quiet but precise. When natural cycles are broken, outer gods fill the void. Because death was sealed away, stagnation spread. Because stagnation spread, rot found purchase. And because rot found purchase, an entire land was reshaped into something neither alive nor dead. Yet even rot does not speak. It communicates through symptoms, through flowers blooming in blood-soaked soil, through knights who rot from the inside yet refuse to fall, through a goddess who blooms again and again, never fully dying, never fully living. This is not cruelty, it is indifference. Outer gods do not hate the world, they do not love it either. They express themselves, and reality bends accordingly. Blood, too, has its silent patron. The formless mother exists not as a shape or presence, but as an absence given hunger. She does not require temples, she requires wounds. Wherever blood is shed with intent, her influence stirs. This explains the strange mechanics of blood magic in the lands between. Blood incantations grow stronger with sacrifice. Power scales not with skill, but with suffering offered. To wound oneself is not a cost, it is an invocation. The political structure surrounding this god is equally quiet. Mohg did not proclaim himself a god's champion through conquest. He hid, he whispered. He built a dynasty not through law, but through ritual. His followers did not need to understand the formless mother. They only needed to bleed. And she answered. This reveals something unsettling about Elden Ring's world. Faith is optional, function is not. Outer gods do not care if they are misunderstood. They care only that the conditions required for their existence continue. A rotting swamp, a mind broken by despair, a wound that never closes. And so the lands between slowly become a patchwork of overlapping divine influences, each silent, each patient. Above them all, the greater will watches without comment. Its grace still guides tarnished feet, its fingers still twitch with half-formed prophecy, yet its system no longer dominates completely. The shattering fractured not only the Elden Ring, but the certainty that any single god truly governs reality. The world is no longer ruled, it is contested. And in this quiet contest, mortals matter more than they ever have. Because outer gods cannot act directly, they need vessels, champions, empyreans, tarnished, broken kings, devoted monsters. Each choice made by these individuals becomes an opening. Each decision invites one silence over another. The lands between do not ask which god is right. They ask which silence you are willing to live with. And as grace guides the tarnished forward, deeper truths begin to surface. Truths buried beneath ancient cities, sealed beneath the earth, waiting in places untouched by the earth tree's roots, places where even gods once feared to tread. Beneath the lands between, far below the reach of golden roots and broken thrones, there are places where silence feels older than the world above. These depths were not carved by accident, they were hidden. Long before the Erd tree cast its vast shadow, before grace learned to guide the lost, civilizations thrived beneath the earth, cities of stone and starlight, peoples who did not look upward for divinity, but outward toward the dark sky beyond the world. This is where the story of the silent gods becomes most revealing. The eternal cities were not merely settlements, they were an alternative philosophy of existence. Nokron, Nokstella, names now spoken only in fragments, yet once they represented a civilization that rejected the greater will's vision of order. They did not worship the Erd tree. They did not accept the fingers. They sought a different kind of truth. Their power came not from runes of order, but from stars. In Elden Ring, the stars are not distant lights, they are active forces. Each star carries fate, motion, and possibility. To study the stars is not astronomy, it is divination. This is how astrologers, sorcerers, and scholars once read destiny itself. The eternal cities believed that fate should flow freely, unbound by imposed law. Where the greater will sought to fix reality into stable systems, the stars represented change, chance, and autonomy. This is why their punishment was absolute. The greater will did not argue with the eternal cities. It did not send messengers. It sent a falling star. The cities were buried. Their skies were stolen. Their people were forced into a false night, lit only by artificial stars. This was not destruction for destruction's sake. It was containment. Here we see another core system of Elden Ring's world. Divine authority enforces itself by controlling access to fate. By banishing the eternal cities underground, the greater will severed their connection to true stars. Fate became centralized, order was preserved. Yet silence breeds resentment. In the deep, something learned to wait. The dark moon is not an outer god in the same sense as rot or flame, yet it stands outside the Golden Order's authority. It represents a quieter rebellion, one rooted not in destruction, but in distance. Where the Erd tree glows warmly and demands devotion, the dark moon is cold, remote, watching. It does not rule, it observes. Rani the witch understood this distinction. She did not seek to replace the greater will with another tyrant. She sought to remove divine oversight entirely. Her age would not be one of louder gods, but of silence stretched across the stars. This is why her path required such sacrifice. To escape the greater will's control, Rani destroyed her own body. In Elden Ring, the body is not merely flesh, it is a contract. Empyreans are bound to outer forces through their physical form. By abandoning hers, Rani broke the chain. This reveals a hidden mechanic of the world. Godhood requires anchoring. Outer gods cannot act without vessels. The greater will cannot rule without Empyreans. Remove the anchor and divine influence weakens. Rani's alliance with the Dark Moon was not worship, it was alignment. A shared belief that the world should unfold without constant intervention. In her ending, the Age of Stars, the gods do not disappear, they simply step back. Fate is no longer dictated by fingers interpreting silence. It is carried by distant constellations, slow and impartial. This is a rare moment of gentleness in Elden Ring's history. Not because it promises happiness, but because it promises space. Yet not all buried gods are so restrained. Deep beneath Leyndell lies a place deliberately hidden even from scholars. A prison beneath the capital. A seal placed not to protect the world from invaders, but to protect it from knowledge. Here burns the frenzied flame. This tells us something critical. The frenzied flame is not new. It existed long before the shattering. It was known, feared, contained. Its philosophy was so dangerous that it could not be allowed to spread naturally. Unlike rot, which grows where conditions allow, the flame spreads where truth overwhelms hope. Those who learn too much, those who see the cruelty of order too clearly, those who realize that suffering is systemic, not accidental. The flame offers a terrible clarity, that all divisions are lies, that gods and mortals alike are trapped, that ending everything is kinder than maintaining endless pain. This is why its followers do not recruit, they awaken others. And so the lands between exist in layers. Above ground, the earth trees' fading order. Below, the remnants of defiance. Beneath even that, sealed truths that threaten to unravel everything. Every god is silent, but their silences are different. One silence commands, one silence decays, one silence burns, one silence watches from afar. And the Tarnished walks among them, not as a chosen savior, but as a variable, a moving point where systems intersect, a question given flesh. The world does not ask the Tarnished to listen. It asks them to choose which silence will shape the next age. To walk the path of the Tarnished is to walk through overlapping silences. Every ruin, every fallen knight, every half-forgotten shrine speaks not with words, but with absence. Something once stood here, something once mattered, and now only traces remain. This is not coincidence, it is design. The Tarnished exist outside the divine hierarchy by nature. They are neither chosen vessels nor born demigods. They are recalled because they are not worthy, but because they are unclaimed. Grace does not guide them because the greater will trusts them. It guides them because it has few options left. Here we uncover a subtle but essential system of Elden Ring's world. The Tarnished are not champions, they are placeholders. When divine order falters, the system calls back those it once discarded, the exiled, the graceless, the forgotten. They return not to restore the past, but to decide what replaces it. Yet the Tarnished do not walk alone. Every major power in the lands between watches them, not openly, but with quiet expectation. Outer gods do not speak, but they observe potential. They wait for signs, for tendencies, for choices that reveal alignment. This is why influence often appears after action. When a Tarnished embraces blood, the formless mother responds. When despair deepens, the frenzied flame stirs. When patience and distance define a path, the dark moon watches more closely. No god commands the Tarnished directly. Instead, each offers a structure that rewards certain behaviors. This is how divine manipulation truly works in the lands between. Not through force, through feedback. The demigods learned this lesson too late. Take Godric, grafting flesh upon flesh in a desperate attempt to matter. His actions echo the greater will's philosophy in its most distorted form. Order at any cost, power through accumulation, identity sacrificed to function. Godric does not serve an outer god consciously, yet he embodies a system created by one. In Elden Ring, intention matters less than alignment. One does not need faith to become a symbol. Radon, by contrast, offers a different tragedy. His mastery of gravity magic was not merely martial skill, it was cosmic defiance. By halting the stars, Radon froze fate itself. In doing so, he unknowingly upheld the greater will's deepest fear, change. The stars carry destiny, motion, possibility. By holding them in place, Radon prolonged stagnation. His eventual madness, brought by rot, was not ironic, it was inevitable. This reveals a harsh truth. Even resistance can serve the system it opposes. Radon fought the stars to protect the world, yet in doing so, he preserved the conditions that allowed rot to thrive. His silence after madness became another opening for an outer god to express itself. Melania's path is quieter but no less revealing. She does not worship rot. She resists it. Yet resistance does not negate influence. Each bloom brings her closer to becoming what the rot requires, a goddess not by belief, but by function. In Elden Ring, divinity is not a reward, it is a consequence. To act as a god acts, to endure as a god endures, is to slowly become one, even unwillingly. This is why the age endings matter so deeply. They are not moral choices, they are system updates. To mend the Elden Ring is to reaffirm the greater will's structure. Order remains. Death may be restored or altered, but hierarchy persists. Silence continues, interpreted by fingers and enforced by vessels. To embrace the frenzied flame is to reject all systems entirely. No order, no distinction, no suffering, because nothing remains to suffer. A mercy born of annihilation. To follow Ravi is to decentralize fate. The gods withdraw, the world becomes colder, slower, less guided. Freedom replaces protection. Silence becomes distance rather than control. Each ending answers the same question differently. Should the world be governed, erased, or released? And still, none of the gods speak. They never congratulate, they never mourn, they never explain. Because explanation creates responsibility, silence does not. As the Tarnished gathers runes, defeats demigods, and ascends toward the shattered throne, the lands between do not grow louder, they grow quieter. The earth tree's glow weakens, the fingers hesitate longer. Even grace seems uncertain, flickering rather than shining. This is the sound of systems awaiting replacement. And in that stillness, the most unsettling realization emerges. Perhaps the gods were never silent because they were distant. Perhaps they were silent because they were finished, their work complete, their structures built, their influence embedded so deeply into reality that words were no longer necessary. The future of the lands between does not depend on divine speech. It depends on what mortals do when no one is speaking anymore. As the Tarnished draws closer to the heart of the lands between, the world feels strangely lighter, not safer, not kinder, but less constrained. This is the quiet sensation of a system losing its grip. The Erd tree still stands, vast and luminous, yet its presence no longer explains the world the way it once did. Its roots coil through catacombs and forgotten graves, but they no longer answer every question. Grace still points forward, but its guidance feels hesitant, as if even it no longer knows what outcome it serves. This is because the greatest transformation in Elden Ring is not physical, it is administrative. The gods are not dying, they are being outgrown. For ages, the lands between functioned as a managed reality. Rules were installed, cycles were enforced, souls were processed, returned, and redistributed through the Erd tree. This system did not exist to create happiness, it existed to create stability. Stability, however, requires maintenance, and maintenance requires belief. Over time, belief weakened. The shattering exposed the machinery behind divinity. Mortals saw gods bleed, demigods bickered, fingers contradicted themselves, silence stretched too long to feel intentional. Once this happened, the divine structure began to fail in a very specific way. It stopped being inevitable. This reveals another fundamental system of the world. Gods in Elden Ring do not rule by force alone, they rule by narrative. As long as the Erd tree was seen as eternal, its authority remained unquestioned. As long as death was feared and grace was trusted, the greater will's order persisted. But when the story fractured, obedience became optional. The Tarnished embodies this fracture. They see the world without myth. They walk among ruins that once claimed eternity. They hear fingers speak in riddles that no longer satisfy. They witness outer gods offering power without meaning. And still, the world responds to them. Because even silence listens to action. When a Tarnished claims great runes, they are not merely collecting power, they are reclaiming authority. Each rune once held a law of reality. To gather them is to assemble the components of governance itself. This is why the Elden throne matters, not as a seat of honor, but as a terminal, a place where reality can be rewritten. Whoever sits there does not become a god in the old sense, they become a maintainer. Yet here lies the final irony. The gods never intended mortals to reach this point. The system was designed with intermediaries, empyreans, fingers, prophets, vessels. The Tarnished bypass all of them. They reach the core not because they were chosen, but because nothing remained to stop them. This is the legacy of silence. By refusing to speak, the gods removed themselves from accountability. By remaining distant, they allowed interpretation to rot into contradiction. By enforcing order without explanation, they created a world that eventually sought answers elsewhere. And answers, once sought, cannot be unlearned. The lands between now stands at a threshold where every age is equally fragile. Order can be restored, but it will be known as artificial. Chaos can be embraced, but it will erase all meaning. Distance can be chosen, but it will leave the world cold and alone. None of these paths are evil. None are merciful. They are simply responses to a long silence. This is what the silent gods leave behind. Not commands, not blessings, but responsibility. And so the Tarnished steps forward, not as a hero chosen by fate, but as a listener who has endured long enough to hear what silence truly asks. Not obedience, not devotion, but decision. The lands between does not need another god who will never speak. It needs someone willing to act, knowing no answer will ever come back. As the path narrows and the earth tree looms closer, something unusual happens to the silence. It no longer feels distant, it feels personal. The lands between begin to respond not as a system, but as a memory. Old enemies fall more quietly. Ancient guardians crumble without ceremony. Even the echoes of great battles seem softened, as though the world itself is tired of conflict. This is not weakness, it is acceptance. For the first time since the shattering, the world is no longer waiting for instruction. It is waiting for closure. In earlier ages, meaning flowed downward, from gods to demigods, from demigods to mortals, from mortals to the land itself. Every action existed within a divine framework, explained or at least justified by a higher will. Now, that hierarchy has dissolved. The silence remains, but its function has changed. Silence is no longer command, it is space. This shift reveals one of the deepest mechanics of Elden Ring's world, one that is never spoken aloud but governs everything that follows. When divine authority withdraws, reality does not collapse, it decentralizes. The Erd Tree once acted as a singular axis. Souls returned to it, blessings flowed from it, order radiated outward. With its dominance weakened, smaller systems begin to emerge. Local meanings, fragmented beliefs, personal truths. This is why the world feels scattered. It is not broken, it is plural. Every ending offered to the Tarnished reflects a different way of handling this plurality. But long before any throne is claimed, the Tarnished already lives in a world where divine certainty has ended. This is why encounters feel quieter now. The enemies that remain are not defending gods, they are defending habits, old loyalties, lingering narratives that no longer serve a living order. Knights still kneel to absent lords, priests still chant to silent fingers. Creatures born of rot or flame persist because no new rule has replaced them. Here, the role of the Tarnished becomes clearer. They are not a conqueror, they are a translator. Through action alone, they convert silence into outcome. Consider the way grace behaves near the end of the journey. It does not guide with confidence. It flickers, it hesitates. Sometimes it vanishes entirely. This is not abandonment, it is delegation. The greater will's system no longer assumes compliance. It waits to see what will replace it. Even the two fingers reflect this uncertainty. Once confident interpreters of divine law, they now fall silent themselves. Their movements slow, their prophecies contradict. They can no longer pretend clarity where none exists. This is a rare moment of honesty. For the first time, the intermediaries admit what has always been true. They never understood the gods. They only spoke because silence frightened others. Now, silence frightens no one. The Tarnished has seen too much to be intimidated by the absence of answers.
This is where the world's final lesson begins to take shape. Godhood in Elden Ring was never about wisdom. It was about distance. The farther a god stood from consequence, the easier it was to rule. The closer one moves to the ground, to bodies, to pain, the harder silence becomes to maintain. By stepping into the center of the system, the Tarnished eliminates that distance. Whatever age follows will not be administered from the stars or whispered through fingers. It will be enacted by someone who walked every ruin personally. This does not make the future brighter, but it makes it honest. The silent gods do not disappear at this moment. They retreat into irrelevance. Their structures remain as echoes, as influences, as old habits written into stone and blood. Yet for the first time, they are no longer the authors of the world's direction. They become background, memory, context. And in that softening quiet, the lands between do something extraordinary. They endure. Not because a god commands it, not because an order enforces it, but because existence, stripped of oversight, chooses to continue anyway. At this stage of the journey, the lands between feel less like a battlefield and more like a remembrance. Not of victory, not of loss alone, but of presence. Everywhere the Tarnished walks, traces remain. Not messages, not instructions, but impressions. A throne left empty, a sword resting where its owner fell long ago, a minor Erd tree struggling to grow without guidance. These are not signs of decay. They are signs of a world learning to exist without supervision. This is where the silence of the gods reveals its final nature. It was never absence. It was inheritance delayed. For ages, divine systems shielded mortals from consequence by absorbing responsibility. Order decided what was allowed. Fingers interpreted what was correct. Outer gods embodied inevitabilities so mortals would not have to question them. Now all of that weight has shifted. The Tarnished carries it. This is why the final approach feels inward rather than upward. The Erd tree no longer dominates the sky in meaning. It becomes a symbol, not a command. A monument to an age where reality needed explanation from above. And monuments do not speak, they remind. In Elden Ring, remembrance is a quiet mechanic of the world. Items carry memory. Locations preserve intent. Even enemies repeat patterns learned in forgotten ages. This is how the world teaches without instruction. When a Tarnished learns a spell, it is not merely acquiring power, it is inheriting a fragment of belief. Gravity magic carries Radahn's defiance. Blood incantations remember devotion through pain. Wrought techniques echo survival without renewal. Knowledge here is always residual. This is why the silent gods still matter even as they fade. Their systems remain embedded in the habits of the world. Souls still linger. Madness still spreads. Rot still blooms. These are not active choices by divine beings anymore. They are the after effects of laws once enforced. The world is living with its history. And history, unlike gods, does not leave quietly. One of the most telling moments occurs when the Tarnished stands before the fractured remains of divine authority and realizes something subtle. No god objects. There is no thunder, no condemnation, no final decree. This confirms what the lands between have been teaching all along. The gods are not silent because they are watching. They are silent
because they are finished intervening. Their purpose was to establish systems. Once those systems proved unsustainable, intervention ceased. Not out of mercy, but out of limitation. Outer gods cannot adapt. The greater will cannot compromise. The frenzied flame cannot create. The rot cannot renew. Only mortals can change without becoming singular. This is the final advantage of the tarnished. They are inconsistent. They doubt. They hesitate. They choose differently when faced with the same silence. And in a world shaped by rigid divine principles, inconsistency is freedom. The lands between no longer need a God who never speaks. They need time. Time to let broken cycles settle. Time to let new meanings emerge slowly. Time to exist without being interpreted. As the tarnished reaches the culmination of the journey, the silence deepens one last time, not as pressure, not as command, but as a shared understanding between world and wanderer. Whatever comes next will not be perfect, but it will be owned. The silent gods will remain in memory, in myth, in lingering mechanics that shape reality's edges, yet they will no longer define the center. That role now belongs to those who walk, who endure, and who decide without instruction. There is a moment near the end of all journeys when movement slows without being forced. Not because the path is blocked, not because danger has passed, but because the world itself seems to breathe more softly. This is where the lands between now rest. The tarnished has crossed every boundary that once separated mortals from divine design. They have walked through systems that were never meant to be seen from the inside. They have touched laws disguised as blessings, and blessings that revealed themselves as restraints. And still, the silence remains. Yet it no longer feels heavy. It feels settled. In earlier ages, silence demanded interpretation. The fingers moved, prophets spoke, kings claimed meaning where none was given. Silence was treated as a puzzle to solve, a message to decode, a command waiting to be clarified. Now, silence asks nothing. This is the final transformation of divine absence. Silence is no longer authority. It is context. The world continues to function, not because a God wills it, but because enough systems remain intact to sustain motion. Gravity still binds, souls still linger, death, in whatever form it now takes, still closes cycles. These are not miracles, they are inertia. And inertia is more patient than any god. This reveals the last system worth understanding. Reality in Elden Ring was never sustained by belief alone. It was sustained by continuity. Even when the greater will imposed order, it relied on repetition. Souls returning, laws enforced, runes reassembled. When those repetitions broke, chaos did not follow immediately. Instead, the world adapted. Small Erd tree sprouts continue to grow, imperfect and dim. Sorcerers still read the stars, even if fate is no longer fixed. Warriors still swear oaths, even when no lord listens. These acts persist because meaning has shifted inward. The silence of the gods made room for this shift. Without oversight, intention matters more than obedience. Without prophecy, Choice matters more than destiny. Without command, responsibility cannot be deferred. This is why the Tarnish's presence feels different now. They are no longer a challenger to divinity. They are a witness to transition. The lands between do not erupt into celebration or despair. They settle into a quieter rhythm, one that does not promise salvation or doom, but endurance. This is not an ending defined by triumph. It is defined by continuation. The silent gods fade not with finality, but with irrelevance. Their names remain, their scars remain, their influence lingers in rot-scarred soil, in flame-touched eyes, in blood-soaked altars. But the center has shifted. The world no longer waits for them, and in that realization, the greatest fear of the gods is fulfilled. A world that no longer requires explanation from above is a world that no longer requires gods. Still, this is not rebellion, it is maturity. The lands between have lived long enough under borrowed meaning. They have suffered under imposed truths. They have endured silence that demanded obedience. Now they inherit silence that allows existence. And the Tarnished stands at the edge of this inheritance, not as a ruler crowned by divine fire, but as someone who stayed when no one spoke back. That is the quiet courage Elden Ring never names. At the very edge of this long quiet, something subtle becomes clear. Silence was never the enemy of the lands between. Dependence was. For centuries, the world learned to lean upward, toward trees that glowed, toward fingers that twitched, toward runes that promised meaning if assembled correctly. Mortals were not weak, but they were conditioned to believe that purpose must arrive from beyond themselves. The silent gods encouraged this belief by doing nothing to correct it. And so, when their voices never came, generations filled the gap with ritual, law, and fear. Now, standing in the aftermath of that long reliance, the Tarnished witnesses a different kind of stillness. Not the oppressive quiet of waiting, but the calm of something finally understood. The gods were never guides, they were constraints. This realization reshapes everything that remains. The Urt Tree, once the axis of all existence, now feels like an artifact of an earlier mindset. Its roots still grip the land, but their authority has softened. They no longer pull every soul back into a single narrative. Death, altered and fractured, begins to behave less like a function and more like an experience again. This is an important shift in how the world works. Under the Golden Order, death was managed, souls were processed, recycled, returned. Individual endings mattered less than continuity. Now, with that system weakened, endings regain their intimacy. Loss becomes personal, memory becomes fragile, life becomes finite in meaningful ways. This is not cruelty, it is definition. Without gods enforcing endless continuation, moments matter again. The outer gods, too, recede into a different role. Their domains do not vanish, but their expansion slows. Rot spreads only where neglect allows it. Madness burns only where despair is fed. Blood rituals lose coherence without centralized devotion. These forces require belief in action to persist, and belief is no longer guaranteed. The world is learning discernment. This is why the Tarnished's final steps feel less dramatic than expected. No grand revelation waits, no final truth is unveiled. Instead, there is an overwhelming sense that the world has already moved past the need for climax. The gods did not fall in a single moment. They faded as relevance faded. And this, perhaps, is the most unsettling fate imaginable for beings who once shaped reality itself. To be remembered, but no longer required. In the quiet spaces left behind, something gentler emerges. Communities rebuild without prophecy. Knights lay down arms without orders. Scholars study the stars not to predict fate, but to understand beauty. These are small acts, but they are foundational. They do not replace gods, they render them unnecessary. The tarnished, having walked through every imposed system, now understands that power is not the ability to command silence, but the ability to live within it. This is the final inheritance of the silent gods. Not dominion, not truth, but the lesson that meaning survives absence. And so the lands between do not close their eyes when the gods turn away. They open them. In the final stretch of this long quiet, the lands between no longer feel like a world awaiting judgment. They feel like a world exhaling. The storms have passed, not because they were defeated, but because there is nothing left for them to argue with. Order no longer demands obedience. Chaos no longer needs to scream. The ancient tensions that once pulled reality apart now rest, unresolved but no longer urgent. This is what remains when gods step back. Not peace in the celebratory sense, but stillness without fear. The tarnished stands within this stillness and understands something that no prophecy ever explained. The gods did not fail because they were cruel. They failed because they were static. Each represented a single answer to existence, enforced endlessly. Order without compassion, decay without renewal, flame without creation, distance without guidance. None of these could grow. Mortals, by contrast, are defined by contradictions. They adapt. They change their minds. They carry regret and still move forward. This flexibility is not a flaw. It is the only force capable of surviving a world without instructions. This is why the age that follows, whatever form it takes, is quieter than those before it. There are fewer miracles, fewer absolutes, fewer moments where the sky itself intervenes, and that is precisely why it endures. The divine systems of Elden Ring were loud in their influence, but brittle in their design. They required constant reinforcement. Once cracked, they could not heal themselves. The world, however, could. Left alone, the lands between do not collapse into meaninglessness. They reorganize, slowly, imperfectly, organically. Ruins are not cleared overnight. Old beliefs do not vanish immediately. Some still kneel to the Erd tree's memory. Some still fear the flame. Some still chase Rot's promise of endless becoming. But none of these dominate. For the first time, plurality becomes stable. This is the final system the world adopts. Not a single truth, but coexistence of many small ones. Local meanings, personal codes, shared stories passed quietly rather than enforced loudly. In this sense, the silent gods achieve something they never intended. By withdrawing, they allow the world to become truly alive. And the tarnished, having carried the weight of divine inheritance without ever being given answers, becomes something rare in the history of the lands between. Not a god, not a prophet, but a participant, someone who acted without certainty, someone who chose without validation, someone who accepted silence without resentment. This is the highest form of agency the world has ever known. As the echoes of ancient authority finally fade, the lands between settle into a rhythm that does not need explanation. Wind through broken arches, light across quiet water, footsteps that do not seek approval. The gods are still there, in memory and in consequence, but the world no longer waits for them to speak. It listens instead to itself. Time moves differently now, not faster, not slower, but without insistence. In earlier ages, time in the lands between felt driven as if pulled forward by unseen hands. Eras began and ended with declarations. Ages were named, laws were announced. Even decay followed schedules imposed by divine intent. Now, time simply passes. And this too is a consequence of silence. Without gods enforcing progression, history loses its urgency. Events no longer rush toward prophecy. They unfold, quietly, unevenly. Some regions heal while others remain scarred. Some stories end without resolution. Others continue without recognition. This is not neglect. It is autonomy. The tarnished, having walked through every layer of imposed meaning, begins to sense this shift most clearly in the land itself. Fields once warped by divine conflict grow wild rather than ordered. Creatures adapt instead of obey. Even enemies, fewer now, feel less like guardians of systems and more like remnants of habits that have yet to fade. This reveals another truth about how the world truly works. The lands between were never sustained by divine presence alone. They were sustained by repetition. Rituals repeated often enough became reality. Beliefs reinforced long enough turned into law. Silence accepted long enough felt sacred. Now, repetition weakens, and in its place, variation emerges. Consider how magic behaves in this quieter age. Sorcery no longer feels like an extension of cosmic authority. It feels personal. Two scholars may study the same star and come away with different understandings. Incantations shift slightly depending on intent. Faith becomes interpretation rather than obedience. This was once unthinkable. Under the Golden Order, belief was standardized. There was a correct way to understand grace, death, and purpose. Divergence was heresy, but heresy only matters when authority is present to enforce it. Now there is none. The silent gods, in withdrawing, have dissolved the concept of heresy itself. This does not mean the world becomes harmonious. Differences still cause conflict, but conflict now arises from perspective rather than doctrine. Mortals argue with one another, not with the sky, and this is a quieter kind of struggle. In this landscape, the tarnished no longer feels like an anomaly. They feel like a preview, a being who learned early how to move without guidance, how to persist without validation, how to act without the promise of reward. Others will follow, not because they are inspired by legend, but because they realize they must. The age of waiting is over. One of the most subtle changes occurs in how death is understood. Without a singular divine system enforcing return, death becomes inconsistent. Some souls linger, some fade quickly, some leave traces only in memory. This unpredictability frightens many, but it also restores something long absent: finality. When endings are no longer guaranteed to loop back into continuity, life gains texture. Relationships matter. Choices carry weight. Regret becomes meaningful rather than procedural.
This is not cruelty. It is gravity. The gods once feared this kind of world, a world where suffering could not be explained away as part of a greater plan.
a world where silence did not mean approval, a world where existence required participation rather than submission. That fear shaped the lands between for centuries. Now, that fear has no voice. And still, the world remains. As the tarnished wanders onward, not toward conquest but through observation, the last traces of divine architecture become landmarks rather than laws. The earth tree is no longer the center. It is a memory cast in gold. The fingers are no longer interpreters. They are artifacts of an earlier desperation to be told what to do. What replaces them is not certainty. It is attentiveness. The world listens to itself now, to imbalance, to neglect, to care. Where rot spreads, it does so because nothing counters it. Where harmony returns, it is because someone stayed long enough to tend it. This is the quiet labor the gods never performed, and perhaps never could, because gods are incapable of uncertainty. Mortals are not. This is why the silent gods ultimately relinquish relevance, not through defeat, but through contrast. Their rigidity cannot coexist with a world that has learned to adapt. As this realization settles fully into the lands between, something rare occurs. Silence stops feeling vast. It feels close, like a companion rather than a void. In the quiet that follows certainty, the smallest things begin to matter again. A fire tended without ceremony, a path cleared of fallen stone, a watch kept not because duty demands it, but because presence feels right.
These are not acts worthy of legend. That is precisely why they endure. The lands between, once defined by cosmic struggle, now reshape themselves through modest continuity. Life persists not in defiance of silence, but in harmony with it. Where gods once imposed meaning, mortals now practice it. This marks the final inversion of power. In earlier ages, significance flowed from above. A miracle validated belief. A sign confirmed purpose. Without those signals, mortals once felt lost. Now they discover something gentler. Meaning does not arrive, it accumulates. This is visible even in the land's scars. Rot does not vanish, but it recedes where care returns. Madness does not disappear, but it quiets where connection is rebuilt. Blood rituals lose their pull where suffering is acknowledged rather than exploited. Outer gods still exist. They have not been destroyed, but without systems that amplify them, they shrink into irrelevance. Their silence becomes indistinguishable from the quiet of the world itself. This reveals their final limitation. They cannot participate. They can only influence. Mortals, by contrast, participate even when they influence nothing. This is why the tarnished no longer feels like a solitary figure. Others move differently now, slowly, thoughtfully, without expectation of reward. The age of spectacle fades, replaced by an age of endurance. This endurance does not look heroic, it looks like rebuilding. The Erd tree's shadow still stretches far, but it no longer dictates. New growth does not mirror its form, it spreads unevenly, adapting to soil, water, and time. Some areas remain barren, others flourish unexpectedly. This unevenness is not failure, it is authenticity.
The gods once sought uniformity because uniformity is manageable, but living worlds are not meant to be managed. They are meant to be inhabited. As the Tarnished continues onward, not toward an ending, but into a quieter continuation, the final truth of the silent gods settles fully into place. They were never guardians of life. They were administrators of structure. And structure, while useful, cannot replace care. This is why the lands between did not heal under divine order. Healing requires attention, patience, and the willingness to remain present without certainty. These are not qualities gods possess, but they are qualities mortals practice daily without naming them. The silence of the gods, once terrifying, now feels neutral, even kind, not because it protects, but because it allows grief without justification, allows joy without approval, allows existence without explanation. This is the quiet freedom that emerges when the world is no longer being narrated from above. The story continues, but no longer as prophecy. It continues as life. In this gentler age, the lands between no longer announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly, the way dawn enters a room without waking anyone. Light spreads across stone not as proclamation, but as permission. The world no longer asks to be understood all at once. It allows itself to be known in fragments. This too is new. Under divine administration, everything had a place, a function, a prescribed meaning. Ruins were warnings, creatures were symbols, death was a process. Nothing existed without justification. Now, many things exist simply because they remain. A broken bridge still crosses a stream, even if no army will ever march across it again. A chapel still stands, even if no prayer answers it anymore. These remnants are not waiting to be repurposed, they are waiting to be accepted. Acceptance becomes the quiet currency of this world. The Tarnished learns this not through revelation, but through repetition, by walking familiar roads that no longer lead to confrontation, by passing through regions once
Ruled by fear, now ruled by neglect. By noticing that danger has not vanished, but it no longer organizes itself around ideology. Enemies do not defend doctrines anymore. They defend territories, instincts, hunger, memory. Violence becomes smaller, less symbolic, more tragic, less epic. This is what happens when gods withdraw. Conflict does not disappear, it loses spectacle. The systems that once amplified suffering into legend are gone. No outer god is eager to claim every wound. No fingers rush to interpret every outcome. Without these frameworks, pain becomes local rather than cosmic, and local pain can be addressed. This is why the world feels heavier in a different way. Responsibility no longer floats upward. It settles into hands, into choices, into moments that cannot be deferred. The Tarnished does not carry this weight alone. Others begin to act with similar awareness. Some choose to preserve old knowledge without enforcing it. Others let traditions fade quietly rather than violently. Some still cling to remnants of divine structure, but even they do so without certainty. Faith becomes a posture, not a command. This softening of belief changes how memory functions. History is no longer curated by gods or written into runes. It survives through storytelling, through what is repeated gently rather than inscribed permanently. Stories become quieter too. They do not end with lessons, they end with pauses. Someone tells of the earth tree not as a divine pillar, but as a time when the world felt watched. Someone else remembers the stars not as fate, but as companionship in darkness. These recollections do not argue, they coexist. This coexistence is fragile, but it is real. The silent gods, in their absence, have allowed contradiction to survive without collapse, and contradiction is the soil where living cultures grow. There is no longer a single answer to why the lands between exist, and for the first time, this uncertainty does not frighten them.
The Tarnished senses this most clearly when standing still, not advancing, not fighting, simply remaining present in a place long enough for its details to surface. Wind patterns, insect sounds, the way light refracts through dust. These sensations were always there, but once they were overshadowed by meaning imposed from above. Now they are meaning. This is the final gift left unintentionally by the silent gods. They stripped the world of imposed narratives so thoroughly that what remained was the world itself, untranslated, uninterpreted, alive. As the lands between settle into this quieter rhythm, something subtle but profound begins to surface: memory without worship. In earlier ages, memory was controlled. What was remembered mattered less than how it was remembered. Gods shaped history by deciding which stories endured and which were erased. Victories were sanctified, failures were buried. Even suffering was given purpose, folded neatly into divine narratives that justified its existence. Now, memory drifts freely. The Tarnished walks through regions where names have been forgotten, yet meaning remains. A battlefield without banners, a fortress whose lord is no longer known, graves whose occupants are remembered only through the way stone has been worn smooth by weather and time. These places do not demand interpretation, they invite presence. This is a crucial shift in how the world functions. When gods governed meaning, memory served authority. It reinforced hierarchy. It reminded mortals of their place. But in the absence of divine oversight, memory becomes intimate, personal, incomplete. And incompleteness here is not a flaw, it is mercy. Because when memory is no longer absolute, it allows space for reinterpretation, for healing, for forgetting where forgetting is necessary. The lands between no longer require total recall of their pain. They can choose what to carry forward.
This is something the gods never allowed. Divine systems demand totality, total obedience, total remembrance, total consequence. Mortals, by contrast, survive through selectivity. They remember what sustains them and release what consumes them. This is why the outer gods begin to feel distant now, not because they are weaker, but because their logic no longer fits the world's needs. Rot still exists, but it no longer defines entire regions unless neglect permits it. Flame still burns, but it does not spread without despair to feed it. Blood still calls, but fewer answer, because suffering is no longer framed as sacred currency. Without divine amplification, these forces lose momentum. They become conditions, not destinies. The Tarnished senses this change most clearly in moments of stillness, not during battle, but afterward, when no new enemy rises, when no sign appears, when the world does not react dramatically to survival. This lack of response is not emptiness, it is trust. The lands between no longer expect judgment. They no longer brace for interpretation. They simply continue, confident that existence does not require validation. This is the quiet confidence of a world that has endured long enough to stop explaining itself.
Even the Urt tree, once the central symbol of divine authority, begins to feel different when approached without reverence. Its presence is immense, but its meaning has softened. It no longer radiates inevitability. It feels like an artifact of intention rather than its source. The roots still bind the land, the light still filters through its branches, but now these are facts, not commandments. This distinction matters. Facts allow coexistence. Commandments demand obedience. The tarnished understands this distinction instinctively now. They no longer seek approval from grace. They no longer measure worth by response. Action has become its own justification. This internalization of meaning marks the true end of the gods' relevance.
Not when they withdrew, but when mortals stopped needing their reaction. The silent gods did not anticipate this outcome. Their withdrawal was not generosity. It was limitation. They could not adapt. They could not soften. They could not compromise. But mortals could, and did. This is why the world does not rush toward a new age with the fervor of past transitions. There is no hunger for replacement gods, no widespread desire for new absolutes. The pain caused by certainty lingers too deeply for that. Instead, the lands between learn to live with open-endedness, open-ended lives, open-ended histories, open-ended futures. This openness is not comfortable, but it is real. As the tarnished moves forward, their role shifts yet again. They are no longer even a catalyst. They become a participant among others, one voice in a chorus that no longer seeks harmony through dominance, but through tolerance of dissonance. This is the most fragile stage of all. A world without gods can still fail, but it can also learn. And learning, unlike divine decree, requires time. Time that no longer answers to prophecy. Time that belongs to those who remain. The longer the lands between exist without divine supervision, the more their quiet reveals a deeper texture. At first, silence felt like the absence of something removed too suddenly, a void where instruction once lived. But over time, that void fills not with answers, but with patterns, small repetitions, human rhythms, cycles shaped not by cosmic law, but by habit, care, and necessity. This is how worlds truly survive. The tarnished begins to notice how places change when no one is watching them for symbolic meaning. A ruin stops being a reminder of failure and becomes shelter. A road once traveled by armies becomes a path for traders, wanderers, or nothing at all. Absence of use does not erase worth, it simply alters it. In divine ages, usefulness was enforced. Everything had a role, even suffering. Pain existed to teach obedience. Death existed to reinforce order. Madness existed as warning. Nothing was allowed to be meaningless. Now, meaning becomes optional. This is unsettling at first. Many cling to old frameworks because certainty, even cruel certainty, feels safer than freedom. Some still kneel where fingers once spoke. Some still whisper prayers to a tree that no longer answers. They are not foolish, they are grieving. The gods did not only rule the world, they organized emotion. Without them, grief has no official shape. And yet, grief passes, not through resolution, but through continuation. People remember less sharply. Anger dulls. Reverence softens. What remains is familiarity rather than devotion. The Urt tree becomes something one passes by, not something one centers life around. This is how divinity truly ends, not in collapse, in normalization.
The outer gods suffer most under this shift. Their influence depends on extremity. Rot thrives in neglect, but not in attentive care. Madness thrives in isolation, but not in shared burden. Blood rituals thrive in secrecy, but not in acknowledged pain. As the world grows quieter, these extremes lose their fuel. They still exist, but they no longer define epochs. This is why the lands between do not replace gods with institutions immediately. Structures form slowly. Local agreements, small alliances, informal customs, nothing universal, nothing eternal. And that is the point. The tarnished, once a figure of disruption, now blends into this slow reorganization. Their deeds become stories rather than commandments, told differently depending on who speaks them, forgotten in some places, exaggerated in others.
This variability would have terrified the old gods, because variability cannot be controlled. But variability is how life breathes. In this age, truth is no longer singular, it becomes relational. What matters is not what happened, but how it is remembered and why it is remembered that way. This allows contradictions to coexist without requiring resolution. A world like this is fragile, but it is also resilient. When one belief fails, another does not automatically collapse. When one leader falls, the world does not shatter. There is no single point of failure anymore. The silent gods built a world that depended on them. Their silence forced a world that does not. And so, as days pass without divine interruption, the lands between settle into something resembling humility. They no longer assume importance. They no longer expect meaning to arrive fully formed. They accept partial understanding as enough. This acceptance is not resignation. It is wisdom earned through survival. The tarnished walks on, not toward an ending, but alongside this ongoing becoming. No crown weighs on their head, no prophecy pulls at their steps. They remain because remaining feels sufficient. And in that sufficiency, something rare emerges. Peace without triumph, purpose without mandate, silence without fear. The gods once believed silence was power. They were mistaken. Silence was space, and space, once given back to the world, allows life to choose its own shape. In this new age of quiet persistence, the lands between begin to reveal something that could never exist under divine supervision: unobserved life. For countless eras, existence here unfolded under the weight of expectation. Even when gods were distant, their systems watched. Grace measured worth. Fate charted paths. The Erd Tree gathered outcomes and returned them to order. Nothing truly happened unnoticed. Now, much does, and this changes everything. When no god is watching, actions lose their theatrical edge. A choice does not echo across the cosmos. A failure does not ripple through prophecy. A kindness is not elevated into doctrine. It simply happens, and then it passes into memory, or it does not. This unremarkable quality is what makes it powerful. The tarnished senses this most clearly in places that once felt sacred. Old cathedrals stand open to weather. Their stones still hold warmth from sunlight, not from faith. No curse follows those who enter without reverence. No blessing answers those who kneel. The space has become neutral. Neutrality in this world is not emptiness, it is permission. Permission to exist without being interpreted. Under the gods, interpretation was constant. Every event meant something. Every misfortune was either punishment or lesson.
Even joy was suspect, often framed as reward for obedience. This constant interpretation exhausted the world. Now, the lands between rest from meaning. This rest allows subtle systems to emerge organically. Trade routes form not because a god decrees prosperity, but because people notice where travel is safest. Settlements gather near water, not because of prophecy, but because thirst is universal. Conflict flares where resources are scarce and fades where abundance returns. These are not divine mechanics, they are living mechanics. The Tarnished witnesses this evolution not as ruler, but as observer. Once, observation itself was a divine act. To see was to judge, to notice was to intervene. Now, observation carries no authority. It simply records. This distinction matters deeply because a world that can be seen without being judged learns to behave differently. It becomes less performative, less extreme, less desperate to be noticed.
The outer gods, accustomed to influencing through intensity, struggle here. Their domains rely on amplification. Rot requires neglect that spans generations. Frenzy requires despair without relief. Blood requires suffering, hidden and ritualized. In a world where pain is acknowledged and addressed locally, these forces find fewer footholds. They persist only at the edges. And edges, by definition, do not define the whole. Even magic adapts to this quieter existence. Spells once designed to assert dominance soften into tools. Sorcery becomes study rather than destiny. Incantations become practices rather than commandments. The same energies remain, but their framing changes. This is an important truth about Elden Ring's magic system that was never stated outright. Magic does not originate from gods. Gods merely standardized it. Without that standardization, magic becomes expressive. Two practitioners shape the same force differently. Outcomes vary. Innovation returns. Mistakes occur, but so do discoveries. The world feels less efficient and more alive. The Tarnished, once bound to progression, now moves without compulsion. There is no longer a sense of being pulled forward by unseen hands. Exploration becomes wandering again. The difference is subtle but profound. Wandering implies choice. This choice extends even to remembrance. Stories of the gods fade unevenly. Some communities still speak of the greater will with caution. Others remember rot only as a sickness once endured. The frenzied flame becomes a warning told softly, not a terror shouted. History fragments, but fragmentation prevents tyranny. A single story can dominate. Many stories must coexist. This coexistence is not peaceful in every moment, but it is sustainable. Disagreement does not threaten reality itself anymore. There is no cosmic consequence for dissent.
This is the final liberation the gods never intended. Not freedom from suffering, but freedom from cosmic escalation. The Tarnished, having lived through escalation, recognizes its absence immediately. Conflicts end because they exhaust participants, not because a god intervenes. Resolutions are imperfect, they leave scars, but they do not rewrite the world's laws. The world absorbs them and continues. This absorption is the hallmark of a mature system. As silence deepens into familiarity, it loses its drama. It becomes background rather than foreground. The lands between no longer pause, waiting for something to happen. They are already happening. And in this ongoing, unobserved unfolding, the greatest transformation quietly completes itself. The world stops asking why it exists. It begins asking how it wishes to continue. When a world stops asking why, it does not become shallow. It becomes attentive. The lands between now listen to details that once went unnoticed, not because those details are new, but because nothing larger is demanding attention anymore. Without divine spectacle, the ordinary regains weight. Footsteps echo differently in empty halls. Rain sounds softer against broken stone. Fire warms rather than illuminates meaning. These sensations do not explain the world, they anchor it. In earlier ages, anchoring was the role of gods. They fixed reality in place through laws, runes, and cycles. Without them, anchoring shifts inward, to bodies, to routines, to repeated acts that hold life together when no structure promises permanence. This is how the lands between begin to stabilize again, not through restoration of order, but through familiarity. The tarnished notices that danger now announces itself honestly. There are no longer sudden revelations framed as destiny. Threats grow gradually. Decay is visible before it overwhelms. Madness shows signs before it consumes. This transparency is not mercy from above. It is consequence made visible. Under divine governance, consequences were often delayed or abstracted. Suffering could be justified later. Death could be reversed. Failure could be reframed as part of a larger plan. Now, consequences arrive quietly, close to their causes. This closeness teaches restraint. People learn to intervene earlier, to notice imbalance before it spreads, to respond rather than wait for signs. This responsiveness replaces obedience as the dominant survival trait. Even the tarnished, once shaped by endurance, now learns restraint. Not every conflict must be resolved through force. Not every ruin must be explored. Some things are allowed to remain untouched, not because they are sacred, but because intrusion is unnecessary. This restraint is not hesitation, it is respect. Respect for a world that is no longer structured around conquest. This change alters the meaning of power itself. Power is no longer measured by how much one can impose. It is measured by how much one can leave undisturbed without neglect. This balance would have been incomprehensible to the gods, because gods do not understand limits. They are expressions of singular ideas magnified endlessly. Order without end, decay without closure, flame without renewal, distance without empathy. Each god is trapped within its own principle. Mortals are not. This is why the silent gods fade not through opposition, but through irrelevance. Their solutions are too absolute for a world that has learned to value nuance. The tarnished begins to encounter places where nothing happens at all. No enemies, no artifacts, no revelations, just space. Empty stretches of land where nothing demands attention. At first, this feels unsettling. Then it feels necessary. These empty places function as pauses in the world's narrative. They allow recovery, reflection, forgetting. Under divine systems, forgetting was dangerous. It weakened control. Now, forgetting becomes healing. A world that remembers everything cannot rest. And rest is what the lands between have lacked the longest. As rest becomes possible, creativity returns in small, almost invisible ways. New paths appear where none were planned. Tools are adapted rather than sanctified. Old spells are altered for practical use. Magic becomes craftsmanship rather than doctrine. This quiet creativity does not announce itself, it accumulates. The Tarnished witnesses this accumulation without needing to direct it. Their role, once central, becomes peripheral by design. They do not fade, but they step aside. This stepping aside is not loss, it is success. A world that no longer needs a central figure has healed enough to continue on its own. The silent gods could never allow this. Their existence required centrality, required reverence, required dependence. Without these, they become concepts rather than forces. And concepts cannot rule, they can only be remembered. As night settles over the lands between, not as omen but as routine, the quiet deepens further, not into emptiness, but into continuity. The world breathes, slowly, steadily, without waiting. The silence that once pressed down now spreads out evenly like calm water. Not commanding, not watching, simply present. The silence now has texture. It is no longer a single, overwhelming quiet, but a layering of softer sounds that only emerge when nothing louder demands attention. Wind moving through hollow towers, water collecting in stone basins carved for rituals no one performs anymore. Footsteps that do not echo because the world is no longer empty enough to amplify them. This is how a place tells you it is no longer waiting. The lands between have entered a phase that divine systems never planned for. Self-sustaining stillness. Not stagnation, not decay. A state where motion continues without needing to justify itself.
In the age of gods, stillness was always temporary, a pause before judgment, a silence before command. Something was always expected to follow. Now, stillness is allowed to remain unresolved. This fundamentally changes how existence is experienced. The Tarnished feels it while moving through once significant locations. A throne room without a ruler no longer feels abandoned. It feels complete. Its purpose ended, and nothing rushed to replace it. The absence itself has become the conclusion. This acceptance of endings is something the gods never permitted. Divine systems despise conclusions. They loop, they recycle, they restore endlessly, because finality undermines authority. A god who allows an ending admits limitation. Mortals do not have that luxury. And so, in a world no longer governed by gods, endings finally become real. A village fades and does not return. A lineage ends without successor. A tradition ceases quietly, without condemnation or replacement. These endings do not collapse the world, they shape it. The lands between are learning something essential. Continuity does not require preservation of everything. It requires discernment. This discernment emerges naturally now. Without divine enforcement, people learn which structures sustain life and which merely prolong suffering. Old laws fall away not through rebellion, but through disuse. No one announces their end, they simply stop being repeated. Repetition, once the gods' strongest tool, now becomes their undoing. Because repetition without relevance fades. The outer gods still exert pressure, but it feels diffuse. The scarlet rot lingers in pockets where care never returns. Frenzy sparks where despair isolates. Blood rights surface where suffering remains unseen. These forces no longer threaten the whole. They reveal neglect, not destiny. And neglect can be addressed. This is perhaps the most radical shift of all. Problems are no longer interpreted as divine will. They are understood as conditions that emerged somewhere for some reason and can be approached carefully. The Tarnished,
once shaped by survival through endurance, now learns a different form of resilience, not pushing forward endlessly, but knowing when to remain, when to leave, and when to do nothing at all. Doing nothing becomes an act of trust. Trust that the world does not require constant correction. Trust that intervention is not always improvement. Trust that silence can hold without collapsing. This trust spreads. The lands between feel less tense, not because danger has vanished, but because urgency has diminished. The future is no longer framed as catastrophe or salvation. It is framed as open time. Open time behaves differently. It allows for error without apocalypse. It allows for growth without prophecy. It allows for grief without explanation. The gods could never tolerate open time. Their existence depended on timelines with purpose, with culmination, with inevitability. Without those structures, their silence loses shape. They do not vanish, they blur. They become myths told without fear, concepts discussed without reverence, stories remembered without obligation. Their power dissolves into background influence, like gravity that no longer needs to be named to be felt. As night passes into morning without ceremony, the lands between demonstrate something quietly profound. They are no longer a world defined by what watches them. They are a world defined by what remains when nothing does. And the tarnished remains not as a guardian, not as a ruler, but as a witness to this transformation. A living reminder that survival does not always require direction. Sometimes it only requires space. Time in the lands between is no longer counted by ages. Once, eras were declared as if they were laws themselves. The age of the Earth Tree, the age of the Golden Order. Ages named, framed, and sealed with intention. Each carried
expectations. Each demanded alignment. Time moved forward only when an age was concluded or violently replaced. Now, time drifts. Days pass without being recorded. Seasons change without omen. No proclamation announces transition. The world does not ask permission to continue. It simply does. This is perhaps the most difficult adjustment for those who remain. A world without ages feels unstructured, almost careless. Some search desperately for markers. They rebuild calendars based on old rituals. They count years from half-remembered events. They name periods after disasters or recoveries. But none of these names hold authority. They are attempts to comfort, not to govern. The tarnished understands this instinct. Meaning once arrived in grand frames. Without them, individuals must learn to live without narrative reinforcement. This requires a different kind of endurance, not the endurance of pain, but the endurance of uncertainty. Uncertainty does not threaten the body, it tests the mind. In divine ages, uncertainty was suppressed, prophecy filled gaps, fate explained outcomes. Even tragedy could be rationalized as necessary. Now, outcomes stand on their own. A flood happens, a harvest fails, a journey ends early. There is no greater reason offered. This absence of explanation does not erase suffering, but it removes the cruelty of justification. No one tells the grieving that their loss was required. No one insists that pain serves a cosmic purpose. Grief is allowed to be what it is. This permission changes how sorrow behaves. It becomes quieter, shorter, more human. The lands between, long burdened by divine interpretation, learn to mourn without spectacle. There are no monuments raised to suffering anymore.
no grand laments carved into stone. Loss is remembered in small ways, a name not spoken, a path avoided, a habit gently altered. These subtle memorials do not demand attention. They integrate loss into life rather than elevating it above it. The silent gods never understood this integration. They framed suffering as necessary currency. Rot transformed pain into growth. Flame transformed despair into unity. Blood transformed wounds into devotion. Order transformed death into function. Each god found use in suffering. Mortals do not. Mortals seek relief. This difference explains why the gods lose relevance in a world that prioritizes care over purpose. Divine systems are efficient, but they are not compassionate. Compassion is inefficient. It pauses, it listens, it hesitates. And hesitation is where adaptation begins. As the lands between settle further into this compassionate inefficiency, structures emerge slowly, shaped by need rather than decree. People gather where safety is shared. Knowledge is passed hand to hand, not inscribed into immutable law. Traditions form tentatively, always open to revision. This openness prevents absolutism. Without absolute structures, no single failure can doom the whole. The world becomes modular. Breaks in one place do not cascade everywhere. Recovery is uneven, but possible. The Tarnished watches this modularity take shape. A bridge rebuilt differently than before. A former stronghold repurposed as refuge rather than fortress. Old weapons reforged into tools. Nothing is restored to its original form. Restoration implies return. This world does not return, it reconfigures. Even magic reflects this reconfiguration. Without centralized authority, magical practices fragment into local styles. Spells adapt to terrain, to culture, to individual temperament. Power levels fluctuate. Precision replaces magnitude. Subtlety replaces spectacle. This decentralization weakens the influence of outer gods further. They thrived on scale, on universality, on singular truths imposed everywhere at once. Fragmentation robs them of coherence.
They remain present only where conditions converge long enough to resemble their former domains. And even there, they are resisted quietly, not through holy war, through adjustment. Where rot threatens, soil is cleared, not cursed. Where madness whispers, isolation is reduced, not punished. Where blood rites stir, wounds are acknowledged openly, depriving secrecy of power. These responses are not heroic, they are practical. The gods never valued practicality. It did not serve eternity. But eternity is no longer the goal. Continuation is. As night returns, unannounced and unremarkable, the lands between do not brace themselves. There is no fear of divine judgment. Darkness does not imply danger. It simply marks a change in activity. The world rests, and in that rest, something final settles into place. The silent gods have not been overthrown. They have been outlived. Their structures persist as ruins. Their ideas linger as cautionary tales. Their silence remains, but it no longer defines the shape of the world. Silence is no longer vertical, pressing down from above. It is horizontal, shared, like the quiet that falls between people who no longer need to speak to understand one another. The shared quiet of the lands between does not erase difference, it makes difference bearable. In the ages shaped by gods, difference was dangerous. Diverging belief invited correction.
alternative practice invited punishment. Even silence itself had to align with a greater silence, one sanctioned by divine systems. Anything that existed outside those boundaries was either absorbed or destroyed. Now, difference persists without urgency. The Tarnished walks through regions where life has adapted in distinct, almost incompatible ways, yet no force rushes to unify them. One valley favors old Erd Tree customs out of familiarity rather than devotion. Another ignores them entirely, living by rhythms shaped only by terrain and weather. A third blends fragments of many past beliefs into something loosely held, flexible enough to change. None of these ways are declared correct. They are simply inhabited. This coexistence marks the quiet arrival of tolerance, not as ideology, but as survival strategy. Without gods to impose cohesion, the world learns that uniformity is unnecessary. Stability does not require sameness. It requires enough overlap to allow exchange without collapse. This overlap forms naturally. Trade replaces tribute. Conversation replaces proclamation. Adjustment replaces obedience. These are not moral advancements. They are pragmatic responses to a world no longer governed by absolutes. The Tarnished senses that the most important work now happens without witnesses. Agreements made quietly, boundaries respected without enforcement, conflicts resolved early, not because escalation is forbidden, but because it is costly. Cost is understood differently in this age. Under divine systems, cost was abstract, sacrifice was glorified, loss was rationalized, pain was meaningful because it served something larger. Now, cost is immediate, tangible. A broken relationship is simply broken. A damaged field simply yields less. This clarity discourages excess. The gods thrived on excess, on overwhelming displays, on suffering elevated into symbol. Without a system to reward extremity, extremity loses appeal. Even ambition changes shape. People still desire influence, safety, comfort, but fewer desire dominion. Dominion implies control over systems that no longer exist. Influence now depends on trust, on consistency, on presence over time.
These qualities cannot be seized. They must be maintained. Maintenance becomes the quiet backbone of this world. Paths are cleared regularly rather than rebuilt grandly. Structures are reinforced incrementally rather than replaced ceremonially. Knowledge is updated rather than preserved unchanged. Nothing is sacred enough to remain untouched. Nothing is disposable enough to be ignored completely. This balance would have been impossible under divine rule, because gods do not maintain, they establish, and once established, they expect permanence. The Tarnished, having lived through the collapse of permanence, recognizes maintenance as a form of care far more demanding than conquest. It requires attention without glory, effort without recognition, continuity without promise of culmination. This kind of labor does not create legends. It creates worlds that persist. As the lands between settle deeper into this rhythm, the remnants of divine presence continue to lose their gravity. Shrines become meeting places rather than altars. Incantations become techniques rather than prayers. Even the concept of blessing shifts from supernatural favor to shared support. Language adapts accordingly. Words once reserved for divinity soften. Terms like grace, order, fate remain, but they describe experiences rather than mandates. Grace becomes kindness extended unexpectedly. Order becomes arrangement rather than hierarchy. Fate becomes coincidence remembered after the fact. This linguistic shift matters, because language shapes expectation, and expectation no longer points upward.
The silent gods, once framed as distant rulers, now feel like earlier attempts to explain complexity with certainty. Their silence is understood not as mystery, but as limitation. They could not answer because their answers were incomplete. This does not diminish them, it contextualizes them. They become chapters rather than authors. The tarnished, moving through this contextualized world, no longer feels the weight of cosmic importance. Their actions matter locally, personally, temporarily. And this temporariness does not lessen their value, it sharpens it. A choice that matters only for a short time must be made carefully. There is no eternal correction waiting beyond it, no divine edit. This is the final, quiet responsibility inherited from the gods. To act knowing the world will continue without commentary. As dusk settles once more, unmarked and unobserved, the lands between do not grow still in anticipation. They settle into rest as routine. Fires dim, conversations soften, the night arrives without symbolism. And in this unspectacular transition, the world demonstrates its final transformation. It no longer performs for silence, it lives within it. Living within silence changes the way a world listens. In earlier ages, listening meant anticipation. The lands between listened upward, waiting for signs, omens, interpretations. Even the quiet moments were tense, stretched thin by expectation. Silence was something to be endured until it broke. Now listening turns outward. The world listens to itself. This is not metaphor, it is practice. People learn to notice shifts in weather before disaster forms. They notice tension in voices before conflict ignites. They notice exhaustion before collapse. Without divine correction waiting at the end of every mistake, attentiveness becomes the primary defense against harm. This attentiveness reshapes culture more deeply than any decree ever could. Where gods once ruled through absolutes, mortals now govern through observation. Decisions are smaller, but they are constant. Adjustments are made early, not after catastrophe. Nothing dramatic announces these changes. They blend into daily life. This blending is important.
A world that survives through constant crisis cannot rest. The lands between have known crisis for centuries. Divine wars, shatterings, ages torn apart and remade. Now, the absence of crisis becomes a form of healing. Not because danger is gone, but because danger is no longer central. The tarnished senses this shift most clearly in how fear behaves. Fear still exists, but it is no longer cosmic. It does not suggest that reality itself is at risk. Fear becomes specific, manageable, a broken bridge, a spreading sickness, a brewing conflict. Specific fears invite response. Cosmic fear invites paralysis. The gods thrived on cosmic fear. It kept mortals small, obedient, focused upward. Without it, people focus laterally, toward one another, toward immediate surroundings. This lateral focus dissolves the old hierarchy almost entirely. Authority becomes contextual. Someone leads because they understand a place, a problem, a moment. Leadership rotates. It is revoked quietly when it no longer serves. There is no divine legitimacy to cling to. This instability would have terrified the old order. But instability does not always mean collapse. Sometimes it means responsiveness. The tarnished, once forged through endurance against overwhelming odds, now adapts to a gentler skill set. Listening, waiting, intervening less, leaving when necessary. Their strength is no longer measured by conquest, but by restraint. Restraint becomes the defining virtue of this age. Not restraint imposed by fear,
but restraint chosen because excess is understood to be destructive. This understanding does not come from doctrine, it comes from memory. The memory of what happens when singular truths dominate the world. The gods are remembered not as villains, but as warnings. Not warnings of cruelty, warnings of rigidity. They could not bend, so the world broke around them.
This memory shapes how new structures are approached. Nothing is built to last forever. Even the most important agreements include the possibility of revision. Permanence is no longer celebrated. Adaptability is. This does not eliminate ambition, it tempers it. People still dream, they still plan, they still attempt to shape the future, but they do so with the understanding that the future will resist final definition. This humility would have been impossible under divine rule, because gods cannot accept resistance. Mortals can. As the lands between continue in this way, silence settles into something almost familiar. It becomes background rather than foreground, not a presence to be interpreted, but an environment to move within. The silent gods remain embedded in the world's architecture. Their ruins still stand. Their concepts still echo faintly in language and ritual, but they no longer define direction. Direction emerges from accumulation, small decisions layered over time, adjustments repeated until they form pattern, care extended consistently enough to stabilize fragile places. This is how a world writes itself without authors, slowly, imperfectly, collectively. The tarnished, having witnessed the rise and fading of divine systems, understands that this process cannot be rushed. There is no climax waiting, no final state to achieve. The world is not moving toward perfection, it is moving toward continuity. And continuity, unlike eternity, allows change. As the day passes into evening once more, without announcement or omen, the lands between do not pause. They do not reflect on their survival. They simply continue to exist, moment by moment, within the silence they have learned to inhabit. This is not the end of a story. It is the point where stories stop needing to announce themselves. As meaning begins to emerge from lived moments rather than imposed design, the lands between develop a quieter sense of direction. Not a goal, not a destiny, but an orientation. People no longer ask where the world is going, they ask where they are standing. This shift is subtle, but it alters everything that follows. Orientation favors awareness over ambition. It values position, context, and relationship rather than progress measured against an abstract future. This is how time becomes inhabitable. Under divine rule, time was a corridor. One moved forward or fell behind. Ages succeeded one another with the force of replacement. Each demanded completion. Failure meant stagnation. Success meant dominance. Now, time behaves like a landscape. Some areas are well known, traveled often, shaped by repeated use. Others remain uncertain, visited rarely, allowed to stay undefined. No one expects to traverse everything. No one claims ownership over the whole. This acceptance of partial knowledge becomes one of the world's greatest strengths. The tarnished, who once had to master every danger to survive, now understands that mastery is no longer required everywhere. Knowing when not to proceed becomes as valuable as knowing how to overcome. This restraint changes the nature of exploration itself. In the divine age, exploration was conquest. To enter a place was to claim it, to clear it, to resolve it. Now, exploration becomes observation. Some places are entered briefly. Others are left untouched out of respect, caution, or simple disinterest.
Disinterest, once unthinkable, becomes permissible. A world that allows disinterest is a world no longer desperate for validation. The gods were desperate. They required constant engagement, worship, fear, interpretation. Silence had to be filled with reaction. Now, silence can pass without consequence. This freedom extends even to the remembrance of gods themselves. The greater will is no longer spoken of as authority, but as influence that once shaped systems now dismantled. The outer gods are recalled not as inevitable forces, but as pressures that emerged under certain conditions. This reframing teaches an important lesson. If gods arise from conditions, then preventing those conditions matters more than opposing the gods. This is wisdom born from endurance. Instead of waging war against rot, the world learns to prevent stagnation. Instead of fearing frenzy, the world reduces isolation. Instead of condemning blood rights, the world acknowledges suffering openly. These responses are not heroic, they are preventative. The divine age was reactive. It responded to imbalance with spectacle. The post-divine world is proactive. It adjusts before imbalance becomes overwhelming. This proactive care is quiet enough to be invisible, and invisibility is its strength. The tarnished, no longer singular in their awareness, recognizes others who have learned this way of living. They do not identify themselves as leaders or sages. They are simply attentive. They notice what needs doing and do it without ceremony. Such people rarely become legends. They become continuity. Continuity does not shine, it persists. As this persistence spreads, the lands between grow less brittle. They can absorb shocks without shattering. A drought does not threaten cosmic collapse. A conflict does not herald the end of an age. Problems are scaled to their size. This scaling down is a form of humility the gods never practiced. Because gods think in absolutes, mortals think in ranges. This difference allows the world to remain flexible. Nothing must be resolved immediately. Nothing must be perfect. Nothing must endure unchanged. Impermanence is accepted as structural, not tragic. This acceptance transforms how endings are experienced. When something ends now, it is mourned but not mythologized. Loss is acknowledged without being elevated into doctrine. Pain is treated as something to be tended, not justified.
The silent gods could never understand this tenderness. Tenderness requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires proximity. Gods ruled from distance. Mortals live within reach. As the tarnished moves through this world of reachable distances, they feel something that once would have been unthinkable: relief. Not relief from danger, but relief from significance. The weight of cosmic importance lifts. Actions matter, but they do not define reality. Failure does not threaten the structure of existence. Success does not crown one as eternal. This release allows life to be lived rather than performed. And so the lands between continue, not toward resolution, but toward habit, toward routines shaped by care, toward rhythms that do not announce themselves. The silence that once pressed down now flows through everything evenly, like air. It does not ask to be interpreted. It simply allows things to be. At last, the lands between reach a point where nothing more needs to be carried forward deliberately. Not because everything has been resolved, not because every wound has healed, but because the world has learned how to hold itself. This is the quiet ending the gods never imagined. Once, existence here depended on explanation, on structure enforced from above,
on systems so vast and rigid that they left no room for hesitation. The gods believed that without their order, the world would unravel into noise. They were wrong. What unraveled was not reality, but dependence, and in its place, something softer endured.
The Urt tree still stands, but it no longer defines direction. It is a landmark, not a law. A memory of a time when meaning was centralized, when silence pressed downward instead of spreading outward. Its light no longer claims authority, it simply illuminates what remains. The outer gods linger at the edges of perception. They have not been defeated nor banished. They have been outpaced. Their domains shrink not through resistance, but through irrelevance. Rot fades where care persists. Frenzy quiets where connection returns. Blood loses its power where pain is seen and answered. They remain as reminders, not rulers. And the greater will, once the unseen architect of order, becomes little more than an echo in the structure of things. Its systems persist in fragments. Its influence survives as habit, language, and memory, but its silence no longer demands obedience. It simply exists as part of the past. The tarnished stands within this completed quiet and understands at last their true role. They were never meant to rule forever. They were never meant to replace the gods. They were meant to outlast them. To walk through imposed meaning long enough to see it fall away, to endure silence until it no longer felt threatening, to remain present when no answer came, and discover that presence itself was enough. This is the final inheritance left behind by the silent gods. Not power, not truth, but the space to choose without being watched. The lands between do not enter a perfect age, they enter a living one, a world where stories end quietly, where beginnings are small, where no single voice claims eternity, where continuity is built through care rather than command. In this world, silence is no longer feared, it is shared. Shared between people who no longer look upward for permission, shared between places allowed to exist without purpose, shared between moments that pass without needing to be remembered forever. The story does not close.
It rests, like a fire left to burn low through the night, like footsteps fading without needing to echo, like a world that has finally learned it does not need gods to continue breathing. And so the lands between remain, not watched, not judged, not explained, simply alive.